So isn't this the craziest story you ever heard? I mean, as I finished reading it to you, I got to confess, I found that I had a hard time saying the gospel of the Lord, right? Because there doesn't seem to be much graciousness in this king at all. And more than that, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of good news here. So what are we to make of this story? As I was trying to come up with something to say today, I wrestled with a couple of things. First of all, if that king is God, then how are we to make sense of a God of vengeance, a God who, when his slaves have been murdered, gathers his army together, not to go out and to arrest these murderers and bring them home to trial and to justice, not to just maybe even kill them in an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of thing. No, he goes out, he kills the murderers, and he destroys their whole city. And in the process, probably just hurts a lot of innocent women and children. And so I have a hard time with a God that is a God of vengeance like that. That's not how I see God. The other thing that I struggle with is this man who comes to the wedding garment without the wedding feast without the proper garment. And because he doesn't have the right clothes on, he gets thrown out into the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Just because he doesn't have the right clothes. So, where's forgiveness in any of this? And what about grace? As I was struggling with all these kind of things, trying to make sense of it, I went to our pastor's text study last Tuesday, hoping that maybe I'd get some sort of insight into this story. And sure enough, I was blessed with some insight. It came from Karen Hansen, our worship director, who happens to be an ELCA pastor and quite a good, I think, theologian in her own right. And she garnered this interpretation from another woman pastor, Julie Morris, who's also an ordained ELCA pastor. And so I thought to myself, since this is National Women's Month, and we are about the business of honoring the women in the church, then why not then follow up with the interpretation that these two women have come up with and see where it leads us. So here's what they were telling us. They said that the kind of the interpretation of this parable hinges on the very first line, where Jesus says the king went out. The kingdom of heaven is compared to a king who had a feast for his son. Right? Now when we hear that, often we just typically kind of hear the kingdom of heaven is like a king, right? But to say it that way would mean that it's the same thing as. And that's not, I don't think, what Matthew is intending by this, nor Jesus. Jesus uses the word compared. And when we use the word compared, then what happens is that it means that we're setting two things side by side. And as we do that, we not only look at the things that are similar together, right? But we also notice the differences that are there. And so, when we look at this parable, what we're hearing is, by hearing the word compared, we're hearing that the kingdom of heaven is this. And now we're comparing it to this king, and we're contrasting it as well. So the kingdom of heaven is not like this king, but the kingdom of heaven is contrasted to this king. This very worldly king, this king of vengeance and violence, this king that as people heard this story might say, oh, I think I know what he's talking about. Maybe that's Herod, right? Or even Pontius Pilate. And if that's the case, then maybe that explains why no one wanted to go to the banquet in the first place, right? And then what we do is we compare and contrast this king with this man who shows up at the banquet feast without the proper wedding garment. He's not going along with the festivities. He's not putting on that garment of this worldly king, that garment of violence and vengeance and injustice and oppression, the kind of the garments that worldly kings wear. No, he's saying, I'm not going to do that. That's the way the world works. And there's nothing new there. There's no good news there for us. And so in the spirit of nonviolence, this man stands before the king, silent, speechless, when the king challenges him how he got in without the proper wedding garment. It begins to make sense when we understand that Jesus was telling this parable just a few days before he himself would be standing before Herod. Standing there, silent, in a spirit of nonviolence. And Herod then binds him hand and foot to the cross, where he's crucified and goes into that outer darkness, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. So it seems that through this parable, Jesus is telling us that if we want to know what the kingdom of heaven is like, that we're not to look at this king, this rage-filled, violent, and vengeful king with an army by his side, because that's the way the kingdom of the world works. But instead, look to this man, this unarmed, speechless man, who is cast out into the outer darkness and bondage. In other words, Jesus is saying, if you want to know what the kingdom of heaven is like, don't look at this king, but look at me. Look at me and learn from me. In that I hear some echoes of Transfiguration Sunday. The last Sunday of Epiphany, just before we enter the Lent season. And it's in that story, we see Jesus up on a mountain, and he's transfigured. He's up there with his disciples. And as that happens, this voice from the cloud, God's voice, comes and says to Jesus and the disciples, "This is my beloved Son, the one with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Listen to him and learn from him as he shows us what the kingdom of heaven is like." I suspect that it might be pretty hard for us to see Jesus as this unarmed, bound outcast who's weeping and gnashing his teeth. But if we listen to the parable in this way, then perhaps that's the way Jesus wants us to see him. And certainly he becomes that person on the cross. But when we see this parable through this lens, something begins to happen to us. We begin to see the people who are singled out, those who are exposed and those who are mistreated. We start to see the marginalized people amongst us. Because Jesus identified with them in this parable and became them on the cross. And we cannot not see them. So we begin to notice those who are marginalized and outcast, those who are singled out and mistreated for not wearing the right clothes or the right skin or having the right papers. And our sympathies begin to shift. And all of a sudden we find ourselves not paying so much attention to that king and the banquet and wondering what it is we're going to wear to that banquet. Now instead, we start to begin to worry about that person who is thrown into the outer darkness. We begin to wonder about them and care for them and wonder how we can go and meet their needs and tend to them and their needs. That person who's thrown into the outer darkness might just be that woman who was abused. It might just be that kid in school who's bullied. It might be someone who feels unloved and unlovable. It might just be a person who has done something that they're so ashamed of that they think they're beyond God's forgiveness. It might be a refugee, or a homeless person, or a hungry person who lives just down the street on the other side of town from us. That's how the Word of God works on us. It transforms us and changes the way that we look at the world, and the way that we look at those around us. And it leads us into being more courageous, compassionate, kind, and caring people. In other words, it leads us into living into this kingdom of heaven. Well, I understand Lent to be a season of repentance. It's a time for us to think about how we live in this world and the ways of this world, and then to turn from that and to embrace this kingdom that Jesus has come to bring, and the ways that Jesus is trying to teach us about things. I also see it as a time for us to challenge those deeply held assumptions we have about God and the ways that God works in the world, and how we see each other and our relationships with God and with each other. It's a time for us to open our hearts and our minds to new ways of hearing these stories that Jesus has to tell us, with the idea that we'll grow in our faith. We'll grow in our understanding of who God is and how God works in the world. We'll grow in our relationships with God and with one another. And that's what this new way of understanding this story, that's what it does for me. It challenges me. It pushes me to the limits of my understanding of God. It helps me to see how God works in different ways. And it forces me to look at the people in our community and the people around me with different eyes, so that I can see those who are marginalized and pushed aside. And then realize that I need to go and care for them and care about them. I'm not saying that this is the way to understand this parable. All I'm saying is that it challenges us to understand God and to look at the world around us and the people around us with different eyes. And isn't that what the parables of Jesus are all about in the first place? In a few minutes, you are going to be invited to a banquet feast. And it's not the banquet feast of a violent and vengeful king. It's the banquet feast of a king who is gentle and kind and humble of heart. You are all invited to come to this banquet, good and bad. You're invited to come and to not worry about whether or not you have the proper wedding garment, because you are not going to get thrown out. Come and experience the warmth of God's love as that wine goes down your throat. Come and experience the depth of God's forgiveness for you as you taste that bread. And as you come, beware. Expect that you are going to be changed and transformed. Expect that your heart is going to be changed and it's going to grow, and that you are going to begin to see the world and the people in it with whole new eyes. That, my friends, is the good news. And for that we say, thanks be to God. Amen.